There is an official explanation for how the American frontier was built. Settlers moved west, towns grew slowly, and public buildings followed, constructed piece by piece as communities earned the money to build them. That is the accepted story. It is taught in schools. It appears in textbooks. But in 1836, a county in rural Ohio with fewer than 4,000 residents completed a courthouse with a colonnaded facade, a domed rotunda, and interior plasterwork that would not look out of place in Washington, D.C. The population did not grow significantly for another 30 years. The building was not expanded. It did not need to be. It was built at full scale. From the beginning. Across the American Midwest, across the rural South, across parts of the upper Northeast, and then again in England's market towns and Scottish county seats, the same pattern repeats. A town of 2,000 people. A civic building designed for 50,000. No apology. No explanation recorded in the minutes of the county commission. Just stone, and columns, and space that no one, for decades, would come close to filling. This documentary does not argue for any single explanation. What it does is look carefully at the evidence, at measurements, at dates, at population records, and follow where the pattern leads. The standard explanation offered by architectural historians is a concept called aspirational building. The idea is straightforward. Frontier and provincial communities built large because they believed in their own future. They were optimists. They expected growth. A courthouse built for a booming metropolis was an act of faith in a destiny that hadn't arrived yet. It's a reasonable explanation. And for some buildings, in some towns, it likely applies. But the numbers, when you actually look at them, create friction. In 1830, the town of Circleville, Ohio had a population of 1,024 people. Its county courthouse, completed in 1840, covered over 12,000 square feet of floor space, featured a grand central hall wide enough to hold public gatherings of several hundred people simultaneously, and was built with load-bearing stone walls nearly 3 feet thick, a construction standard that implied not just ambition, but permanence. The building was designed to last centuries, not decades. The same year it was completed, the entire county's tax base was insufficient to fund a proper school system. The county couldn't afford teachers. But the courthouse stood, fully realized, waiting. Circleville is not an exception. In Granville, Ohio, a town that peaked at roughly 2,000 residents through most of the 19th century, an octagonal building of unusual architectural sophistication was constructed in 1105 that still puzzles local historians trying to explain its proportional elegance. In Madison, Indiana, a county of scattered farming communities built a courthouse in 1854 whose central dome reaches 70 feet, not because Madison was growing rapidly, but because that was apparently the design that was chosen. Move east. In Cooperstown, New York, famous now for baseball, famous then for almost nothing, a civic hall was built in the 1830s that seated far more than the resident population could fill. The building had a second-floor gallery, a formal entrance with pediments, infrastructure for a civic life that simply did not exist yet in the village it served. Then crossed the Atlantic. In Dumfries, Scotland, a market town in the Scottish lowlands, the county buildings completed in 1914 replaced an earlier structure that had itself been built in the early 19th century to a scale that local records show was considered, even at the time, slightly baffling. Not criticized. Not opposed. Just noted. As if the ambition of the design was recognized as exceeding immediate need, without anyone thinking to ask why. In Berry Street, Edmonds, England, civic infrastructure from the early Victorian period reflects a scale of planning that the town's actual commercial activity during those decades does not obviously justify. The Corn Exchange, the Guildhall extensions, the market buildings, all of it more than the moment required. What makes this pattern worth examining is not any individual building. One oversized courthouse can be explained by an ambitious local politician or a generous land grant or a burst of civic pride. Architecture is full of overreach. What becomes harder to explain is the consistency. Not just the size, but the type. The buildings that appear disproportionately large in small towns tend to belong to a specific category: civic and governmental structures. Courts, town halls, custom houses, post offices, market exchanges. The buildings associated with administration, commerce, and public record. Not churches. Not private homes. Not industrial buildings. The selectivity of the scale suggests something more organized than scattered optimism. In Dayton, Ohio, which was a genuine growing city by the 1850s, the federal building constructed downtown was large, but proportionate to actual activity. In the small county seat of Washington Courthouse, Ohio, with a population under 2,000 at the time of construction, the county courthouse featured a formal judicial chamber with a ceiling height of over 20 feet and a public lobby that could process hundreds of visitors simultaneously. The contrast isn't between frontier ambition and Eastern refinement. It's between scale and function. Between what was built and what the population, at the time of construction, could possibly have needed. The timing raises questions that the aspirational explanation doesn't fully absorb. Because if these buildings were built in anticipation of growth that in many cases never came, or came 60 years later, then someone was making coordinated decisions about infrastructure across dozens of disconnected counties and towns. Someone was applying a template, a standard, a vision of what civic space should look like, before the civic life to fill it had materialized. That pattern, once you begin tracing it, through the census data, through the construction records, through the architectural surveys, keeps expanding. It doesn't stay in Ohio. It doesn't stay in the Midwest. It reaches further than the aspirational building theory was ever designed to explain. The Erie Canal opened in 1825. It connected the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, cutting a navigable waterway across 363 miles of upstate New York terrain. The engineering achievement was remarkable. What tends to receive less attention is the infrastructure that appeared along its route almost immediately, not after commerce developed, but alongside it, and in several cases, before it. At Lockport, New York, where the canal required a flight of 5 locks to climb the Niagara Escarpment, the surrounding town built civic and commercial structures in the late 1820s and early 1830s that assumed a permanent, established economy. Stone warehouses with thick walls. A town hall. Market buildings. Storage facilities scaled not for the trickle of early canal traffic, but for volumes that would take decades to materialize. Lockport's population in 1830 was approximately 2,500 people. Its infrastructure suggested 10 times that number was expected. The canal towns of upstate New York, Utica, Rome, Syracuse, Rochester, all followed variations of this pattern. Rochester is perhaps the most striking example. In 1820, Rochester had roughly 1,500 residents. By 1830, it had grown to 9,200, genuine, rapid growth that the Erie Canal directly enabled. That growth justifies ambition. But the civic buildings constructed in Rochester during the 1820s, before that growth arrived, were already built to the scale of what came after, not what existed at the time of construction. Someone planned for Rochester's 1830 population while standing in Rochester in 1822. That kind of planning requires information, confidence, or a template already decided. The railway era compounds the pattern rather than resolving it. Between 1840 and 1880, the American rail network expanded from roughly 3,000 miles of track to over 93,000. This is well documented. What receives less systematic attention is the civic infrastructure constructed in railroad junction towns, towns whose entire existence depended on rail traffic, that was built to a scale the actual rail volumes of the period did not justify. In Galesburg, Illinois, a railroad junction town established in the 1830s, public buildings from the 1850s assumed a permanent commercial weight that the town's actual throughput, for most of the 19th century, only partially matched. The train sheds, the depot infrastructure, the administrative buildings associated with rail operations, all of them carry that same quality of anticipation built into stone. In Burlington, Iowa, a Mississippi River crossing point that became a rail hub, the federal customs infrastructure and civic buildings from the 1850s and 1860s reflect planning assumptions about commercial volume that Burlington's actual economy, in those decades, did not fully reach. The buildings weren't wrong about the future. In many cases, the commerce did eventually arrive. But the gap, between construction date and the population or commercial activity that would justify the scale, is consistent enough across enough locations that it starts to feel less like optimism and more like coordination. Cross the Atlantic again, and the pattern doesn't stop. In England, the Victorian-era investment in civic infrastructure is usually explained through two lenses: municipal pride and public health reform. After the cholera outbreaks of the 1830s and 1840s, English towns invested heavily in waterworks, sewage systems, public baths, and town halls. The public health explanation is real and well documented. But the scale of the administrative infrastructure built in English market towns during the same period, towns that were not industrial centers, not growing rapidly, not positioned on major trade routes, exceeds what public health reform alone accounts for. In Taunton, Somerset, a county town with a stable, modest population through most of the 19th century, the civic buildings completed between 1820 and 1860 include a market house, a corn exchange, a county hall extension, and a mechanics institute, all built to a standard of construction and interior scale that implies a civic culture significantly more active and populous than Taunton's actual demographics suggest. The same observation applies to Shrewsbury, to Hertford, to Maidstone, county towns that administered rural hinterlands, built to administer something considerably larger. The grain storage infrastructure of the American Midwest adds another layer. By the 1870s, elevator grain storage was appearing across the wheat-producing regions of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio at a scale that exceeded contemporary production volumes. The argument offered by agricultural historians is forward planning, speculators and railroad companies building ahead of the harvest curve to capture future throughput. Again, reasonable. Again, the numbers create friction. In Bloomington, Illinois, grain elevator infrastructure constructed in the early 1870s had a combined capacity that would have required the entire surrounding county to operate at maximum agricultural output, a condition that wasn't reached for another generation. The elevators sat partially empty for years. They were maintained. They were not downsized. They waited. Whether this reflects inherited infrastructure from an earlier organizational system, or simply aggressive speculative investment, the practical result is the same: capacity built for a population and an economy that arrived late. The administrative similarity across these sites is what accumulates most strangely. A county courthouse in rural Ohio and a market hall in Somerset, England share almost nothing culturally. Different legal systems, different governments, different architectural traditions, in theory. And yet the proportional relationship between building scale and actual civic population, that gap, that consistent overreach, appears in both places, in the same decades, without obvious coordination. The over-engineering is not random. It clusters around specific building types. It clusters around specific decades, primarily 1820 through 1875. And it clusters around a specific function: the administration of territory, commerce, and public life. That clustering, across two continents, in towns with no direct connection to each other, is the detail that the aspirational building explanation handles least comfortably. Whether this reflects inheritance or convergence, whether these towns were drawing on a shared template or independently arriving at similar conclusions, is a question the evidence does not yet close. What it does is suggest that somewhere behind these buildings, behind the stone and the columns and the disproportionate ceilings, there is an organizing logic that hasn't been fully named. A framework, a system, perhaps even a label. The word Tartaria appears in European maps as early as the 13th century. It was not a conspiracy. It was not an invention of the internet. For roughly 600 years, European cartographers used the name to describe a vast, loosely defined territory stretching from the eastern edges of Russia through Central Asia and into China, a geographic label applied to lands that European powers understood imperfectly, administered not at all, and imagined considerably. By the 18th century, Great Tartary appeared on French, British, and Dutch maps as one of the largest nominal territories on Earth. It wasn't a unified empire with a capital and a flag. It was a cartographic habit, a way of labeling the parts of the world that didn't fit neatly into the emerging European system of nation-states. When that system solidified through the 19th century, the label was retired. The territory it described was absorbed into Russia, China, the Ottoman sphere. The word disappeared from official geography. That is the historical record. Straightforward. Uncontested. The modern reinterpretation of Tartaria emerged primarily through Russian-language alternative history forums in the early 2000s, crossed into English-language internet spaces around 2016 and 2017, and accelerated sharply during the years of pandemic-era social media expansion between 2020 and 2022. In its most expansive form, the theory proposes that Tartaria was not simply a cartographic label but an actual global civilization, technologically sophisticated, architecturally prolific, and deliberately erased from the historical record by the powers that replaced it. The civic buildings examined in this documentary, the oversized courthouses, the disproportionate market halls, the grain infrastructure built ahead of demand, are, within this framework, proposed as physical remnants of that erased civilization. Buildings too large, too refined, too coordinated to have been built by the communities officially credited with constructing them. It is a significant claim. And like most significant claims, it contains within it a smaller, more defensible observation wrapped inside a much larger, less supported one. Three interpretation models have emerged among people who take the underlying architectural anomaly seriously, even when they disagree sharply about what it means. The first model is the one this documentary opened with: aspirational building combined with coordinated speculative investment. Frontier and provincial communities built large because land speculators, railroad companies, federal land programs, and ambitious local politicians were all operating simultaneously, often using federal funding and standardized architectural pattern books that circulated widely in the 19th century. Asher Benjamin's pattern books. Menard Lefever's guides. These publications gave builders in rural Ohio access to the same architectural vocabulary used in Washington and London. The scale came from ambition and access to templates. The coordination came from shared publications, not a shared civilization. This model is well supported by documentary evidence. It explains a great deal. What it handles less cleanly is the gap between construction date and the population levels the buildings were designed to serve, and the selectivity of which building types received that treatment. The second model proposes something more cautious than Tartaria but more structural than simple optimism. It suggests that the 19th century saw a genuine, organized transfer of institutional infrastructure, that post-Napoleonic European powers, and their American counterparts, deliberately invested in civic architecture at a scale designed to anchor territorial control, to make permanence visible, to communicate, through stone and columns and domed ceilings, that the administrative order being imposed on new or recently reorganized territories was not temporary. In this reading, the buildings are instruments of governance. Their scale is not accidental overreach but deliberate signal. A courthouse too large for its current population is a statement about who owns the territory and intends to keep owning it. The over-engineering is the point. This model has serious historical support. Colonial and post-colonial architecture studies have documented this dynamic extensively in other contexts: British India, French North Africa, the Spanish Americas. The application of the same logic to internal American frontier territories and English provincial towns is less developed in the academic literature, but the mechanism is coherent. The third model is the one that gives the Tartaria hypothesis its emotional traction, even among people who don't fully accept its claims. It proposes that some portion of these buildings, not all, perhaps not most, but some, predates the communities officially credited with building them. That the 19th century was not an era of construction so much as an era of resettlement and reattribution. That a previous organizational layer, disrupted by some event or process not clearly recorded, left behind infrastructure that incoming populations moved into, repaired, and claimed. The event most frequently cited within this framework is 1816, the year without a summer. Mount Tambora erupted in April 1815 in what is now Indonesia, releasing the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The resulting atmospheric ash caused catastrophic agricultural failure across the northern hemisphere in 1816. Frost in June. Snow in July. Crop failures from New England to northern Europe. Mass displacement. Population movement on a scale that European and American administrative records of the period struggle to fully account for. The return to 1816 is not incidental. It functions, within the third model, as a proposed mechanism, not proof of a lost civilization, but a plausible disruption event large enough to have reorganized population distribution significantly, potentially leaving some existing infrastructure without the communities that built it, available to be inherited by those who came after. It is worth being precise about what this means and what it does not mean. The Tambora eruption is historical fact. The year without a summer is historical fact. The population displacements of 1816 and 1817 are documented. What is not established, what remains entirely in the realm of hypothesis, is whether any of the civic buildings examined in this documentary were constructed before that disruption rather than after it. The metaphor that clarifies the third model most honestly is this. Imagine finding a house already framed and partially roofed on a plot of land your family was just granted. You finish it. You live in it. In 30 years, your children record, accurately, that the family built the house. They are not lying. They are describing what they know. The part of the story they don't tell is not suppressed, it is simply not remembered. The Tartaria hypothesis, at its most defensible, is asking whether 19th century civic history contains a version of that dynamic at scale. Not erasure. Not conspiracy. Inheritance without record. The evidence, taken together, invites examination rather than conclusion. What is observable is real. Buildings built too large, too early, too consistently across too many disconnected locations to be explained fully by any single mechanism. What is interpretable, what remains genuinely open, is the reason. Aspirational optimism, expressed through widely shared architectural templates, explains much of it. Deliberate territorial signaling by administrative powers explains more. And somewhere at the edge of what the documents record, in the gap between construction date and population scale, in the selectivity of which building types were treated this way and which were not, there is a residue that none of the current models fully absorbs. Not a hidden truth. Not a covered secret. Just the ordinary incompleteness of the historical record, and the slightly uncomfortable feeling that comes from standing inside a building that was always, somehow, waiting for more people than ever arrived. The evidence invites examination. What you do with it is your own.